When I think back to reading Bleach on a weekly basis, there are certain moments, certain cliffhangers that really stick out to me as being incredibly memorable for just how exciting they were and how they left you really wanting more. But of course, we had to wait another week to find out what was coming next. One such example comes at the end of chapter 349, The Lust 3, where the chapter ends when Ichigo, who looks pretty dead thanks to Ulquiorra's Sero through the heart, suddenly clasps the floor with a gnarled hand in response to Orihime's cries. His hair suddenly grows long and wild and his back arches as though something has gripped his entire body and is now twisting and bending it to accompany this terrible new power. Even though he's face down, this image is very effective. You can imagine his eyes squeezed shut, his face pressed against the floor, fangs baring in a snarl as an animalistic instinct to protect suddenly overtakes and awakens him once again. I feel like many of us had been really waiting to see something from Ichigo's inner hollow for some time during this part of the story, and with Ichigo being forced to the edge by Ulquiorra's overbearing power, this fight felt like the perfect moment. That entire chapter is a really interesting one as well, in that there had never really been anything like it in the series before, and there wouldn't really be again. An entire 19 pages is dedicated to the death of our hero and the traumatized reactions of his friends as the battle against Ulquiorra seemingly draws to a hopeless close. I've discussed in detail before about the potent impact of this battle atop the dome of Las Noches, so I'll avoid falling down that rabbit hole again, but suffice it to say, the build-up to Ichigo's newest shocking transformation is very effective. But seriously, what is the deal with this form of Ichigo's? This masked, horned beast, a visceral reaction to Orihime's plight that seems to bear all the hallmarks of a hollow, yet with a firm purpose. It comes bearing a firm purpose, something many hollow beings completely lack. While this version of Ichigo is very traditionally hollow-like in its brutality and its seeming lack of empathy and its failing to distinguish friend from foe during its rampage, it is driven by Ichigo's innate wish to protect, and in doing so, it stands in stark contrast to most hollows, whose sole goal is just to consume. It's always been difficult to know what to call this form, which is fitting, I guess, because Ichigo is a very unique being in the universe of Bleach, and so are most of the forms he undergoes as well. Perhaps the most commonly used name by the fanbase for many years was simply VASTO Lord Ichigo, and it's easy to see why. This is clearly a hollow, or at least a hollow-like being at its most humanoid, but due to Ichigo not being a Menos, he can't be classified as such, even if the appearance and power are very similar. Some people even used to believe this was Ichigo's own Resurrection, or his release form, but it doesn't really display any of the hallmarks of a Resurrection to me, from a lack of any kind of release command whatsoever, though admittedly, that is in line with the rest of Ichigo's power set in general, to this form not really resembling Ichigo's original Hollow form at all. And since Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers are innately fused, as opposed to being two separate entities within one soul, he shouldn't really have access to a totally separate form like, say, Tosen. We know that a Resurrection is meant to be the return, the release, of a Hollow's original powers, growing closer to what they used to look like before becoming Arankar. So if that were the case, shouldn't Ichigo's Resurrection more closely resemble this creature he became during his Vizard training? I would assume this form is something all Vizard achieve during their Hollowification training during that process where they subjugate their inner Hollow, and would therefore act as a substitute for any original hollow form they might technically be lacking, meaning this would be where the design of a potential resurrection would be pulled from. Admittedly, full hollow Ichigo is another name and one that I myself have taken to, even though that too is somewhat misleading as well. While this creature definitely takes on the appearance and mannerisms of a hollow, there's far more to it than that, as is usually the case where Ichigo is involved. Perhaps this form should simply be named Zangetsu. Well, regardless, we'll try to answer the question of what this creature actually is, what its deal is, in today's video, as well as take a deeper look at this particularly haunting version of Ichigo, an out-of-control animal that single-mindedly wants to protect Orihime, even at the cost of those Ichigo cares the most about. The battle atop the dome was a bleak affair, and Bleach at its darkest, in my opinion, and this version of Ichigo is the monster that was born out of that pitch-black nightmare. But before we get started on the video, guys, 5 minutes into the video, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up as well to help show your support for me and the channel. And if you want to take that support another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well, and as always, I want to say a massive shout out and a huge thank you to everyone who is supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. And just note, there will be some spoilers for the 1000-year Blood War arc of Bleach in this video as well, though I'll also throw up a second warning when we actually get to that part of the video. First of all, what I've always loved about this form is that it's foreshadowed very effectively. It feels like perhaps the most prominent example of how many of Ichigo's transformations and evolutions are all part of a larger picture. Certainly some elements, like the final Getsuga Tensho, feel plucked out of thin air, but this particular form has been lurking in the shadows ever since the start of the Rancage arc, waiting for its chance to strike. From the moment Ichigo's inner hollow manifests itself during his battle with Byakuya, Ichigo has been at the mercy of a sinister undercurrent that threatens to rise up and rip him down at the slightest sign of weakness. Ostensibly, this inner hollow, is here to help Ichigo and to bail him out of trouble, but from Ichigo's perspective and the readers during the Rancage arc, this is a malignant entity that wants control of Ichigo's body permanently. And so when Ichigo finally quashes him during his training with the Vizard, the inner hollow leaves him with a chilling warning that if Ichigo ever weakens, if he senses the slightest hesitation from Ichigo moving forwards, the inner hollow will rise up and crush him, and that if he really wants to control this being's power, then by the next time they meet, he had better make sure not to die. It's a threat that shouldn't be taken lightly, and although it's a hefty 128 chapters before it's finally realised, the fact that Kubo returns to it at all is fantastic, and in such a dramatic fashion too. So what is this form then? To truly understand it, we need to look at answers that were both given to us far beyond this point in the story and before it as well. Let's start with the visuals, as they're the most striking element of the design, and obviously the first thing we all saw. As fans of both the source material and the anime will now know, this version of Ichigo closely resembles the hollow known as White, that infected his mother Masaki 20 years before the start of the story, with Hollow Reiatsu. Of course, White himself was no ordinary hollow, having been born from a composite cocktail of Shinigami souls as a result of Aizen's experiments, and would later go on to merge with Ichigo's father Isshin's own Shinigami Reiatsu and power. As a result, it makes total sense in my mind anyway that this version of Ichigo, perhaps one of the purest forms he takes, that of pure instinct, takes the very shape of the source of it all. Yes, Ichigo's parents were Shinigami and Quincy, but without White's interference, who knows what Zangetsu would have resembled today. The Zangetsu that we see in the story is how he is, both in looks and demeanour, because he hails from White's influence. If you need more proof, White's blade-like arms even look like the future Tensa Zangetsu. So when Ichigo's power, his soul, emerges in its purest form, it bears the shape of the source, that being the virus itself. But I think if we want to examine the very nature of this form, then we have to start with instinct, the concept of instinct. Everything to do with this transformation revolves around that core idea. Zangetsu himself berates Ichigo during their most pertinent meeting for lacking this vital component, this final piece of the puzzle that makes up a true warrior. As his Zanpakuto spirit itself, it's clear that Zangetsu has a keen insight into the deepest parts of Ichigo's soul, his desires, his goals, and he knows that Ichigo wants to protect those closest to him using his own power. But without the necessary killer instinct to stop fighting with, as Zangetsu himself comments, a sheathed sword, he'll never be able to fully achieve that, and his friends will continue to suffer. That's why when Ichigo, if we can even call him that here, wakes in this form, he's driven by one thing: an instinctual need to protect Orihime, who called out to him and seemingly resurrected him in this moment. It's definitely interesting. Ichigo certainly looks very dead to me when Ulquiorra blasts a cavernous hole in his chest and his limp body hurtles to the ground far below, but it seems like there's some conscious thought left in his head when he can hear that Orihime needs him. It's possible this quiet thought, Ichigo's last-ditch effort to try and do something, is what forces Zangetsu to act, and which is why it acts with such a single-minded determination. Regardless, instinct is driving this walking corpse, essentially, a beast-like instinct to destroy the aggressor and defend the weak. Even though this Ichigo is there to protect Orihime, she's terrified and can't believe it's really him. She doesn't recognize this man at all. And in a sense, that's because it isn't. A monster is wearing Ichigo's body, but for all intents and purposes, this omen standing before them with flames surging in the background really is Ichigo. What's really cool about this moment is that it was always going to happen. Narratively, this is the conclusion of Ichigo's descent into Wako Mundo and the Lair of the Hollow. We've talked before about how the Arrancar arc, and specifically the Wako Mundo invasion, tells the story of Ichigo's fall into Hollowdom. As he battles Dordoni, he tries not to use his mask, but laments in the end. When he faces Grimmjow, he defends Orihime with his body, but his horrific powers frighten her, an exact precursor to what we see playing out here. And finally, when Ichigo reaches the epicenter, the climax of his journey into Wako Mundo, both literally and figuratively, eventually fighting beneath Wako Mundo's everlasting darkness atop of the dome of Las Noches, he becomes this. Everything Orihime feared would happen comes true. It's really the apex, the pinnacle of Ichigo's downward spiral, which began with depression and a crippling anxiety at this gnawing presence inside of him. Notably, he's only able to begin moving forward, once he's left Wako Mundo and we see his training in the Dangai with both Tensa Zangetsu and his inner hollow as a metaphorical light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, knowing the truth as we do from the final arc, this being doesn't have evil intentions at all, as we may have thought when the chapter was originally released, when the divide between Zangetsu and the inner hollow was still being routinely enforced. That being said, due to being a surge of pure instinct, this version of Ichigo is unable to tell friend from foe. Seemingly the only person it can still distinguish is Orihime herself. And so, when Uryu confronts Ichigo, desperate to help him retain some semblance of his humanity, Ichigo turns on Uryu instead, running his sword through his friend's gut before preparing to finish him off with a Sero. To Zangetsu's eyes, Uryu is just another obstacle, just another person who might be trying to harm Orihime. I do wonder what would have happened in that crucial moment had Orihime actually been able to get between Ichigo and Uryu in time. Would Ichigo have called off his attack? Was he lucid enough to realise where she was in proximity to anybody else. And that voice, that guttural, echoing voice that emerges from behind the mask that can just about spit out the words, "I will protect her," is that Ichigo speaking? Or is that the voice of Zangetsu? Or is it a twisted combination of the two? If Ichigo really is still dead here, in quotes, if this is just a walking corpse, a zombie of Ichigo essentially, being controlled like a machine by Zangetsu's spirit, then who is communicating from potentially beyond the grave? It's honestly a really cool concept when you think about it. So this form takes the shape of White, the very source of this malignant power that's infected Ichigo's Shinigami powers, and it seems to be driven purely on instinct, a philosophy that Zangetsu himself espoused to Ichigo long before this form was even a thing. But how strong really is this version of Ichigo, or Zangetsu, or whatever you want to call it? Unfortunately, I feel it's a nearly impossible question to answer. This version of Ichigo exists in a weird vacuum. It's only around for about 4 chapters, and in the space of about half that time, he completely dominates and brutalizes Ulquiorra's Segunda Etapa form. But what's strange about that is we don't really have any frame of reference for how strong that form of Ulquiorra's actually was. Sure, it's totally overwhelming Ichigo, but so was Ulquiorra's initial resurrection as well. But regardless, this masked version of Ichigo is clearly immensely powerful, especially when you consider he's missing around half of his Shihakusho, which Ichigo himself would later mention is tantamount to the actual amount of Reiatsu he currently has. Now, I want to make a comparison here which I think is fairly fitting, but be warned, there will now be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc, so bear that in mind. But I think there's an interesting comparison to be made here that goes overlooked a little bit, and probably for good reason. You'd never normally put these two characters in these two states together, but that's with Toshiro Hitsugaya's zombified state. We all know Hitsugaya is a very powerful Shinigami with an extremely potent and versatile Zanpakuto in Hyorin Maru. But Hitsugaya, crucially, is an inherently good-natured person, much like Ichigo. And much like Ichigo, the two of them often hold back when it comes to fights they could probably otherwise win. However, when Hitsugaya is zombified by the sternritter Giselle Jewel and placed under her command as part of her army, we're given a fleeting glimpse into Hitsugaya's true destructive potential. I made a video analysing how strikingly he transformed from the kind-hearted and shackled Hitsugaya we knew him to be to a brutally effective, cold-blooded killer, almost like an assassin, merciless, able to cut down characters like Ikkaku and Yumachika not only with ease and a cool-headed calmness, but also unfettered from the chains of emotion and reason. This is a very similar situation in my opinion. We all know that Ichigo is immensely powerful, and while he may not have had access to the strength he needed to overcome Ulquiorra in this moment, there's no denying that strength was in there somewhere, lying dormant. And here in this form, Ichigo fights unrestricted, free of care and compassion, and as a result he tears Ulquiorra limb from limb, quite literally, showing almost a disdain for his opponent in the process. Ulquiorra can do little more than stare wide-eyed as Ichigo tramples him from start to finish, ripping his arm off and going so far as to grapple with his Lanza del Relampago using nothing but his bare, clawed hand. While other forms of Ichigo, like Dangai Ichigo and Ichigo's Horn of Salvation form, may be stronger, perhaps even considerably so, than this monstrous appearance, there's no denying this is perhaps Ichigo at his most effective, and certainly most vicious. So to circle back around to the question at the start of this video, what is this form of Ichigo's then? We as readers initially viewed this moment as one of despair at Ichigo's death leading to the birth of a new monster, one fueled seemingly by his inner hollow and its lust for control. Of course, once we learn the truth in the 1000-Year Blood War arc that Ichigo's hollow wasn't lying, and is in fact Zangetsu after all, his Shinigami and hollow powers fused together, then it completely reframes this moment. Rather than believing this is a sinister entity taking hold of Ichigo's body forever, it's instead able to be viewed as his Zanpakuto coming to save him and his friends and pursue Ichigo's own instinctive goals. Old man Zangetsu even deliberately points to this moment as one where his Zanpakuto came to his aid. And so in the end, what this form is, what this supposed full hollow Ichigo actually represents, at least in my opinion anyway, seems to be just his Zanpakuto Zangetsu emerging to rescue its master in his darkest hour, in a display of pure instinct taking over. That's why, with a simple outstretched hand, he's able to summon his blade to him telepathically, something we never see Ichigo accomplish throughout the story, because this being on show here is quite literally the spirit of Zangetsu wearing Ichigo's body. The reason it has such a demonic hollow-like visage is because Ichigo's Shinigami powers are fused with his hollow powers, and have been since the very beginning, since he emerged from Urahara's Shattered Shaft training, wearing both a Shihakusho and a hollow mask. Thanks to this creature is able to access hollow abilities that Ichigo never could without actively delving into that part of his soul, without actively accepting that part of his soul. Sonido, high-speed regeneration, and of course, Sero, which we see Ichigo has learned by the series' end. A sign of his acceptance of who Zangetsu truly is and what actually makes him up. With the knowledge we have now, it seems more likely that this is a perfect hybrid of Hollow and Shinigami. In fact, it's actually very reminiscent of Kensei and Mashiro's hollowified states during Turn Back the Pendulum, where their souls had begun to mingle and the barrier was broken down as the hollowification process took hold. While that process isn't happening to Ichigo here, as he's already undergone that long ago, the balance has definitely been thrown off by Ichigo's death, or apparent death, leading to that hollow power born of White himself to be the dominant appearance in this moment. In many ways, this form, like so many others that Ichigo undergoes, is just one of many precursors to his eventual final stage, the final version of himself where he has truly accepted and mastered all powers that he has, and perhaps is even the first true version of what Aizen wanted to create, what he wanted to build. This version of Ichigo is like a precursor to what Ichigo would eventually become, and the first step on that evolutionary journey, that first step of becoming a perfect hybrid of the many races of Bleach. But those are just my thoughts regarding Ichigo's full hollow Zangetsu form, whatever you want to call him. What did you think of this appearance when it first reared its head? I'd love to know your thoughts and theories down in the comments below. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a like, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.